discussion on cross-contamination and safeguarding your business. And I'm going to leave it to Ian Ferris from the University of Birmingham to introduce your speakers. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ian Ferris. I'm a lecturer at the University of Birmingham, and it's a great pleasure today to talk with Jatin and Tiziana about a recent incident that probably many of you will be aware of that hit the news with regard to mustard that was contaminated with peanut powder. So I'll just hand over to Jatin and Tiziana just to say a little bit about themselves first before we discuss this topic.
Hello everyone, my name is Jatin Patel and I'm Head of Operations at FGS Ingredients, a family business that was established in 1974 and in third generation of leadership at the moment.
Hello, I am Dr. Tiziana Sgamma from the Montfort University. I am an associate professor in molecular biology and I research around using DNA testing for improving the quality standard of herbal product.
Okay, thanks. So I just want to start off with just, I guess, a little bit of background and so the event and tell us what happened to you and your business.
No problem. So I was at the airport when I was informed of the complaint regarding a possible mustard contamination, peanut contamination. We immediately initiated a traceability and testing of the product. 4 samples were drawn and sent for testing. Our initial reaction of shock and disbelief, as it was never a known issue. We routinely at FGS carry out risk assessments of all our products. It's never a known issue by us or anyone else, as we are regularly horizon scanning as well. I came in early the next day to catch up on emails and the complaint when our unannounced BRC auditor showed up for their annual audit, and without a technical manager who had left the week before to join a company closer to home. When we received the results back, 3 samples tested negative and 1 tested a low positive, but still a positive. We informed the BRC auditor on site, EHO and FSA of our findings, and based on the results, we were advised and decided to initiate a recall based on precautionary grounds. As we still didn't know where the contamination was coming from, we decided to get a third-party testing carried out of the factory and the staff. Was it coming from our factory? The results were clear of the ongoing issue. He, like us, was in shock and disbelief. GT Agro, who is a BRC accredited and a nut-free site, like us, we had also instructed him to get a third-party swabbing done of his factory, which had also come back negative. To give customers reassurances and confidence, we had now started testing all products we were supplying to customers, and also all other batches of mustard we had on site from India. These batches initially tested negative. But as the testing grew, we saw some batches of mustard were testing negative and positive. With the help of EHO and FSA, we realized that the batches of mustard had hotspots, which meant there was no consistency. These batches were not just from one supplier in India. We were seeing it from a number of suppliers. Therefore, after advice from the EHO and FSA and on the grounds of abundance of precaution, we withdrew all mustard and any blends containing Indian mustard going back 2 years, even though we had test results showing a negative result on certain batches. As the contamination wasn't from our factory or our suppliers, our investigation took us back to the farm. We realized that the farms were growing peanut in nearby proximity to the mustard, as well as using second-hand bags to fill the crop when harvesting. We realized that there was possible cross-contamination happening here at farm level, which has been confirmed now by the Indian government and FSA for being the source of the cross-contamination. Not all the recalls were by FGS. Most were initiated by our customers or customers of customers, but they were down as FGS on the alerts. That's how it initially started.
Okay, thanks, Jatin. So, the root cause, I'm right in saying that. So, what was the root cause that they felt that it was?
They said there was two possible reasons. One being the second-hand bags that were being used by the farmers, and possible soil contamination.
Okay. And Tiziana, what's your views of those hypotheses? So there's two potential hypotheses of the bags and and I guess from the farming practices there.
I think that in this case, because of the plant that was collected was mustard, and therefore is the aerial part, the top part that is outside the ground that is collected, there is a bigger chance that the contamination happened because of maybe reusing bags, or maybe using the same machinery for the collection of the product, rather than having a contamination spreading through the soil. That could be a possibility if we were collecting a different type of material that actually grows as peanuts under the soil, like, I don't know, garlic, for instance. But in this case, probably the issue happened after the harvesting, so not during the process of when the plant was growing in the soil.
And I'm right in thinking that you do quite a bit of testing of allergens in your job, and analysis of foods and so on for allergens. So can you tell me, what are the challenges then in identifying? So in an issue like this, obviously it relies on testing to actually identify that there's a problem. And what are some of the challenges with regard to identifying the problem or the hazard in the first place?
I think there are mainly three challenges. One is sampling. As we mentioned before, it's not always, we don't always have consistent results because the sampling process can be different. We can take a sample from a bag and is resulting negative, and the next door bag will have a positive result. The second challenge is probably the technique that is used for the testing. They are not all reliable at the same level. The product they get processed, they get dried, and therefore there is a degradation that can happen at both protein level or DNA level. So it's also selecting the correct technique for verify that the sample might be positive or negative. So these are kind of maybe the two main issues, but also maybe find out where the contamination has happened, so then we can go back and rectify the issue. If the problem, for instance, could be just using second-hand bags, if you know that is the issue, you can go back and train the people that are harvesting the product, let them know that they should not do it, and then it's an easy way to actually be sure that after the product that you obtain is good quality.
Good. And so when testing products like mustard, of course we're talking about contamination, isn't it? And contamination by its very nature is not homogeneous throughout the whole product, and that kind of causes the problem, I guess, with regard to sampling, because of course you might find one part is positive and the other is negative. But what are your opinions on with regard to then when you find contamination, so you get a positive, is it always unsafe? So from a consumer's point of view, if you have a positive, should that automatically result in a withdrawal, or should the food should always be considered unsafe by getting a positive result?
Okay, so in my opinion, it does depend on what kind of technique has been used for the testing and what kind of plant we are also testing as well. Of course, when we talk about peanut contamination, there is the caution that we need to take, because it could have a big impact on the consumers. But it also depends on the level of contamination, and also depend on how the product is used, and in which field. For instance, if there is a spice that is used in a very small concentration for the production of a mix of spices, then there is a difference. So the level of contamination has to be taken in consideration. The possibility of having a false positive can be taken in consideration. This technique that we use for checking peanut contamination, we know that they could give a false positive. For instance, with fenugreek, there is a cross-reactivity with the protein that are tested for peanut in the ELISA testing, for instance. So there should be the testing should be done at in different level and go in parallel. So having a couple of different testing, for instance, protein and DNA, hand to hand. And then if that is positive again, then of course we need to react.
So do you think then, so something precautionary allergen labelling, obviously with regard to cross-contamination, usually a trigger when you have low levels is to put a precautionary allergen label on it. The PAL statements may contain or contains traces of it, etc. Jatin, what's your views then with regard to then the use of PAL? Are you now using more PAL on your product as a result of this? Has it kind of like scared you to put PAL on everything now, so everything you have may contain, or what actions have you taken since?
To be honest, during the recall and the withdrawal, we were instructed by the EHO to put PAL statements on everything, and since then we've been working, obviously my technical team have been working on it, doing a series of tests, more risk assessments, and we were in the process of removing what we could, but we have put PAL statements on our products, and it's meant we've lost customers, because the reality of the situation is, in the industry itself, people don't want PAL statements on products, even if there is a known risk in the supply chain.
Yeah, and that's interesting, isn't it? Because a product, something like, a PAL statement on something like mustard, which is used in hundreds of products at small quantities, means that as a primary or a primary ingredient, it then goes into so many, and then it means that hundreds of products then have a PAL because of the mustard. And I guess that's where you then get into the issue with regard to the levels of contamination. So a low level of contamination in mustard would be an even lower level of contamination in a product that contains mustard, I guess, which is the whole point of the vital research and the Codex Alimentarius guidance on the EDO5s and the EDO1s and so on, which is really interesting. So, as a consequence, you mentioned obviously the impact of some of your customers don't want PAL statements. Tell us a little bit about the actual consequences to you and your business as to actually when this all happened.
I think the biggest question we've tried to answer since the incident is, how do we protect ourselves and our customers from the unknown? We and everyone in the industry can protect itself against consumers, against known risk, but it's impossible when none of us knew that risk existed. So since obviously the recall and the withdrawal, we at FGS have started testing all ingredients against peanut and other allergens. We've implemented testing with suppliers to test the product before we receive it, and we're testing internally as well on arrival and before dispatch as well. Like we mentioned, we've initiated PAL statements where there's a known risk, which has meant we've lost customers. We're regularly swabbing the factory and the staff as well at the moment, and we're also reassessing all suppliers in more depth, which is still ongoing.
And what advice would you give to, so if there's other businesses, because of course it's very easy, particularly on social media, in certain posts and so on, there's always people that make judgments, and they kind of like were full of good advice with regard to what this happened and so on, what they should have done, and etc. What advice would, it's really great to actually be speaking with somebody that was at the center of it as well, and being so transparent. What advice would you give to businesses with regard to the unknown? Because what we're talking about here, isn't it, is something that's never happened before, an unknown risk. How do you protect yourself from something that is an unknown, as it were?
to give you an idea, the impact it had on our business was immense. You know, we have a recall policy which was followed at the time. We regularly carry out mock product recalls to test the process, but we realise practice and reality is very different. How do you practice the wider pressure of the levels of stress it creates within the business? Just to give you an idea, whilst the recall withdrawal was going on, the knock-on effects it had, and some of the issues we were dealing with at the same time. We had a winding up petition initiated on us, which was withdrawn within 2 hours, as they didn't have all the correct information. But what we didn't realise is for 24 to 48 hours, your credit rating goes to zero. As our credit rating went to zero, most of our suppliers thought because of the recall withdrawal, we were liquidating or closing down. We were asked to clear all balances by the next working day before midday, and we were put on pro forma for about 3 to 4 months, which made it very difficult for us. Our banking partner was notified by the insurance companies as well and started their own due diligence process restricting our use. We had professional consultants, a couple of them, showing up at our family home on a Sunday, unannounced, to give us advice, which caused us a huge amount of stress and pain to the whole family. We had daily requests of 30 to 40 traceabilities a day from the EHO on customers, which for a business our size, it was impossible for us to do in a day, along with answering around 800 emails from all our customers who all wanted answers immediately and as quickly as possible. We were all working 16, 17 hours a day, 6 to 7 days a week for three months, just to get back to everyone and answer questions from the AHO and customers. That created its own pressure for us. That was some of the problems we were dealing with at the same time in the business.
So, really difficult times, really difficult. And I guess, is it possible to actually prepare for that kind of thing, or is it?
Can't. Well, to be honest, it's very difficult. How do you prepare for the stresses of the knock-on effects or the dominoes of effects it creates within the business? But you know, we are, you know, if I talk about us, and that's the only thing I can do to give advice to anyone else, is we are putting more controls in place. We are doing more due diligence. You know, to give you an idea, we're doing more testing, but is it viable commercially? I don't know. You know, that's the only thing we can do. We can only revert back to our testing, our screening, our traces, our supply chain, to put more security onto the business. How do you prepare for, you know, multiple times the solicitor showing up at your family home on a Sunday? I don't know. It's a very difficult question to answer.
Yeah. So I want to turn to the audience now. Is there anybody in the audience that has any questions, either to myself or Tiziana or Jatin with regard to this particular incident? Yes.
That you went through, and you know, all we can do is really sympathise in, like you said, the stresses that you went through. Going forward, though, I mean, I know you're doing a lot of testing, you know, but when you mentioned about the hot spotting and you can't always detect, sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative, is there no option then? Do we have to have PAL labelling for everything? Because we can do as much testing as we possibly can, but it may not pick everything up. And to protect ourselves in the food industry, do we have to go down that route?
Okay, so from a technical point of view, I think that there is a little bit of work that can be done to make this testing more reliable and picking up when effectively there is a proper contamination, so not having false positive, for instance. And my research group is working towards that, and hopefully that will be something that we can pass along to other companies as well. So that's one thing. Also, there is the chance of having a false negative, which again is something that is often not much talked about, because when you receive a negative result, you think that's okay, we can just carry on with our business. But again, that is about having the right technology to be able to pick up when there is a very, very small possibility of having a contamination. So that's from a technical point of view. At 0% completely clean product, I mean, that is probably not something that we can achieve in any field for any type of contamination. It's just about being able to be sure that the contamination level will not affect our consumers, I guess. From a different perspective, probably leave the voice to...
And to be honest, it's risk assessing your supply chain. One of the things I learned during this whole experience was when the FSA or the EHO, or when you're looking at a farming level and seeing what the farmers have grown, usually we were looking at in the last couple of years. Actually, they need to keep records for the last 5 years, because the trace can be passed down into other products for 5 years. I didn't know that. You know, there was something I learned during this experience. And it's also just sampling. You know, like Tiziana mentioned, like for us, we take a representative sample out of each and every bag. You know, it's retained, that's our retained sample, and from there we sent it for testing, because it should represent the whole batch itself. And it's making sure those controls are correct before you make any decision.
Can I just also add one more thing? When you send your product for testing, the issue that I've seen looking at some testing results that they've been shared with me is that the information that you get is not much. You often get a positive and negative, but there is no real information on what has been tested. When we talk about peanut protein, there are several, about 13 or even more protein that could be affecting the consumers. So which one has been tested for? There are some that they stay in the correct shape, let's say, and they are not degraded over time easier than others. So, you know, which one has been looked for? And that information is not something that the company is too willing in actually sharing. And therefore, if you send your sample to two different companies, one come positive and one negative, it doesn't mean that your product is a negative or positive. It could mean that the different company have used and checked for different protein. So that particular protein might not be present when they look for it. There are different ways to go around it. Maybe not look for protein DNA, but looking for peanut DNA more generally. So that would, be more standardized across the different companies that do the testing. But again, we don't really know what the company has tested for, because they don't share that information.
And the other thing, just for your information, is what we learned is the FSA also say, when you're testing your product, it doesn't mean it's safe. It's a form of control, but it doesn't mean then that the product itself is safe to use.
Because I guess many of you be aware of the current work in at Codex Elementaris level and the vital research for eliciting dose levels. So I think that's one of the challenges that we have currently at the moment. Apart from gluten and sulfur dioxide, there isn't a legal minimum standard, and I guess the issue is that as the tests become more and more sensitive, and the lower levels that you get, even lower levels that potentially you can test take in a test and get a positive result. And this is where potentially you need these levels that you can find, because the issue, I guess, is that at Codex there's a proposal for the eliciting dose level of the EDO5, which is basically that the levels in a foodstuff, if it goes above a level that would affect only the 5% most sensitive of individuals, then that if it's below that level, then a PAL statement wouldn't be required, and that's something like 2 milligrams for peanuts. And of course, the issue then is what should happen is then a business would then be able to calculate. So if you had something like mustard that was maybe contaminated at 10 parts per million, if you're only using that at say 1% in your product, the level of contamination in the mustard wouldn't be significant in your product, so you could calculate actually whether or not that level of contamination was a risk to your product, and whether you have to use a PAL statement on that then based on the amount of contamination that you find within the product, because it's more diluted. Because the issue that you have is always with regard to allergens is the issue with regard to safety and then availability, because the more that I guess that you drive and the more sensitive the test results come, if you have it in a, like I said earlier, in a product like mustard, is you then have a proliferation of PAL on everything for peanuts because of that minor ingredient.
Yeah. And it's also understanding what's an acceptable limit, like Ian was mentioning. In EU MRL state, it should be less than 2.5 ppm on peanut. In our particular case, the FSA decided to follow the levels of detection, which is 0.167 ppm, and that was just changed. I think from what our understanding and what the discussions we had, it was only changed a day before our incident started. And that's one of the conversations we're having with the FSA, is how do we get that information across to other people in the industry? Because, if you're changing the acceptable limits, it needs to be made aware. Otherwise, we're all following the wrong acceptable limits, and that's something we're working on at the moment as well with them.
And I do feel a little bit, I guess, for the competent authority, when you've got something like a new problem, a new issue, as to what data that you've got. So if you get one person that's tested the product and it's never been found before, and suddenly you've got it, you've still got, I guess, with regard to sampling, as to whether or not that one sample is that representative of everything, or is it the lowest level that actually, I guess the theory is, could there be higher levels found in other products? And I guess if you're talking about your priority to protect the public, then of course you can understand why the competent authority would take a very precautionary approach, but to the detriment maybe of food businesses potentially. So any other questions within the audience?
Hi, I'm Phil Arnold. I'm the Special Situation Manager for Mondelez International. Thank you very much. Really good to hear that. Very open and honest. So I really appreciate you telling us all that. What changed? Because we hadn't found this before, and then it was detected. Did something change in the farm, or was it just the fact that it was detected? So was it there before that we hadn't seen it? I guess we're trying to understand what was the change.
To be honest, it's, from our understanding, it's something that was never tested before. No one was ever. It was not a known risk, or no one really knew that risk was there in the beginning. So if I look at our records or our history, or to be honest, like anyone, when you find something which is no one knew about, I even went on Google to searching to see if there was anyone else come across something like, and I didn't come across anything, and that was it. It was detected because a customer made a complaint to say that they've had a reaction to something. So what you do on a blend, you'll go through each and every ingredient, work your way through each and every ingredient, start your testing processes just to see, okay, what can it potentially be? We looked at our risk assessment, and that's how it was detected and picked up. And obviously our first point of call is, because it wasn't a test we'd carried out before, because it wasn't a known risk to us, we sent it for testing, and we took out multiple batches, multiple samples, and that's how the whole thing started. And that's why when the initial one was done, the first recall, The EHO and the FSA said we'll do it on precautionary grounds because the results were so inconsistent. And then the last one was a 2-year mass withdrawal. It wasn't a recall. They classified it as a withdrawal. They classified it that under abundance of caution. Even then, we didn't have any consistency in what we were testing, or the results weren't consistent.
So I guess in theory then, if it's never been tested before, never found it before, it could have been going on for a while, and nobody had ever picked it up. So not necessarily something that was a new catalyst that suddenly triggered something, but just a random test.
And to be honest, what we've done as a business, so because we still couldn't get any consistency in the mustard tests from India, we've just moved away from the Indian origin completely in terms of mustard. We've gone to other origins like Ukraine and Canadian, but then we have an issue of flavour profile and the pungency of the product, and is that delivering what the flavour profile the customer wants in their products. So that's where we are with it at the moment.
I think is that time? I'm going to carry on. Okay. So any other questions or any other comments? Anyone wants to add?
University of Birmingham. Thank you for that. It's a really insightful discussion. But if we go back to the source of contamination, which is at the farm level, and as you said, you've got different suppliers from around the world. How hard is that to actually control then? The reuse of bags, if we're going to, sustainable practices, aren't we? We're trying to reduce packaging and all that kind of thing. So, and again, I suppose the farms have got the least amount of profit that they're making through the supply chain. How do we make sure that practice is actually implemented at that ground level?
I think that's part of our ongoing supplier risk assessments we're carrying out at the moment, because is to make sure those controls and that follow-up is continuously done at farm level. And like you mentioned, them not making much money at farm level, it's very difficult for them. This is why they were using second-hand bags. If you talk to them, to give you an idea from what they were telling us, a brand new bag might cost them 50 pence, but the second-hand bag was costing them 6-7 pence in equivalent. So it's, for them it's logical to pick up a second-hand bag. In terms of control and how they protect that, it's something we're working on with our suppliers, with the farmers at the moment, to see how we can better make this process better for them.
Anybody else? Any other questions? No? Okay. Good. Well, it's been great. It's been great. It's a real credit to you, the fact that you can come out and be so transparent. We can wrap her up there. And get any other questions. Thank you very much for your time and for listening to us today.
Thank you very much indeed. A heart-warming story, and my heart goes out to you.